There are things that happen in corridors, not in the rooms where the official events occur, not in the operating theaters or the concert halls or the courtrooms or the studios where the recordings are made and the decisions are taken and the history is written down for later reference. Those rooms get the documentation. Those rooms get the photographs and the testimony and the carefully preserved accounts. But the corridors, the spaces between the rooms, the places where people wait and absorb and try to hold themselves together in the aftermath of what has just happened, the corridors get almost nothing, and sometimes everything. In July 1958, a 17-year-old boy sat in a corridor at Sefton General Hospital in Liverpool and tried to understand something that could not be understood. His mother had just been taken from him, not by illness, not by something that had announced its coming and allowed for preparation, but by the sudden, arbitrary violence of a car on a street outside his aunt's house on a warm summer evening. Julia Lennon was 44 years old. She had been crossing the road, and then she was gone, and her son was sitting in a hospital corridor at whatever hour the emergency had deposited him there, alone in the particular way that the very young are alone in the presence of an incomprehensible loss. His name was John Lennon. He was 17 years old. He did not yet know that he was going to matter. Margaret Collins was on shift that night. She was 31 years old, a staff nurse at Sefton General, 7 years into a career that had given her considerable experience of what hospitals actually are, not the clean, purposeful television version, but the real version, full of waiting and uncertainty and the particular quality of silence that descends on a ward when something final has happened, and the machinery of medicine has done everything it can do, and the only thing left is the human part. She had seen many people in corridors. She knew, by that point in her career, the different textures of shock, the noisy kind that announces itself, and the quiet kind that sits very still and looks at a point on the floor and does not move. She knew which one required intervention and which one required something more careful than intervention. She saw John sitting in the corridor, and she knew immediately which kind this was. What she did next was small. It was also, in ways that neither of them could have known then, one of the most consequential small things that would happen in the story of what John Lennon became and what he put into his music and what millions of people would eventually receive from it. She sat down beside him. That was all. She did not speak. She did not offer the professional consolations, the assurances about everything possible being done, the gentle questions about whether there was someone to call, the practiced language of sympathy that has been worn smooth by repetition until it slides off the surface of grief without making contact. She simply sat down beside him in the corridor and was present, and she stayed there for the better part of an hour, and in that hour something passed between two strangers that did not require words to be real. This is the story of what that hour contained, and of what it produced in the decades that followed, in a boy who became a voice and a woman who never stopped hearing it. Margaret Collins had grown up in Birkenhead, across the Mersey from Liverpool, in the kind of household where the wireless was always on and music was the background against which ordinary life happened. Her father worked at the shipyards. Her mother kept the house and sang while she did it, hymns mostly, and the occasional popular song she had learned from the radio and could not quite remember all the words to, substituting approximations that were somehow more affecting for their imprecision. She had trained at the Royal Liverpool Hospital and moved to Sefton General in 1951, drawn by the particular culture of the ward there, a consultant she respected, a team that took their work seriously without losing their humanity in the seriousness. By 1958, she had developed the judgments that nursing develops, when to act and when to wait, when words help and when they intrude, when the most useful thing you can offer is your presence in the absence of language. She was not a person given to sentiment. She had chosen a profession that required its management, not its suppression, which produces people who cannot be present to suffering, but its direction, its application where it would actually do something rather than simply be expressed and dissipate. She had sat in many corridors beside many people. The boy on that July night was not the first and would not be the last. But something about him lodged in her memory in a way that most corridor nights did not. Perhaps it was the quality of his stillness. The very young, in the presence of sudden loss, are often either noisy or frozen, but John's stillness was different from frozen. It was the stillness of someone thinking very fast, very privately, converting something unbearable into some other form as fast as it was arriving, because the unbearable form was too large to hold directly. She sat beside him because she recognized something, and recognition is itself a form of care. The hour she spent beside him in the corridor was not, from the outside, eventful. He did not speak for the first 20 minutes. She did not require him to. A colleague passed and raised an eyebrow, and she made a small gesture that meant, "I have this, keep going." The ward sounds continued around them, the distant institutional noise of a hospital at night, trolleys and voices, and the particular quality of late-shift light that is neither day nor dark, but something institutional and indeterminate. When he did speak, it was not to say anything that required a response. He said his mother's name, once, not loudly, not as a question or a statement or a call. Just the name released into the corridor air, as if saying it confirmed that she had been real and was now not. Margaret heard it and said nothing. She simply stayed. Later, she would say to her daughter, to her colleagues, to the very small number of people with whom she discussed that night at all, that she had done nothing. That she had simply been present because presence was what the situation required and she happened to be there. She did not experience the hour as an act of particular kindness. It was, in her account of it, simply what you did, what any person of decent instinct would have done in the same corridor with the same boy. She was wrong about this, though she could not have known it then. What she did in that corridor was give John Lennon the first evidence that the world contained something other than the fact of his mother's absence, that another human being could sit beside the worst thing that had ever happened to him and not try to fix it or explain it or make it into something more manageable than it was. That someone could simply stay. He had been given this by Julia, in her way, Julia who sat on the floor and played banjo and laughed too loudly, and did not require him to be anything other than what he was in any given moment. Julia who had taught him guitar and played Elvis records on Sunday afternoons and was the closest thing to unconditional presence that his complicated childhood had produced. And now Julia was gone, and a stranger had sat down beside him in a corridor and stayed for an hour without requiring anything, and this stranger could not have known that what she was doing was, in some essential way, continuing the thing his mother had started, demonstrating that it was possible to be present to a person without demand, without condition, without agenda. The boy in the corridor absorbed this. He did not know he was absorbing it. He would not know it for years. He might not have been able to name it even then, though the music he made would name it repeatedly, in the particular way that music names things that language cannot quite reach. When Margaret finally stood up, her shift needing her, the ward making its claims, she said something simple. Not a platitude, not a professional formality, something brief that she would later struggle to remember precisely because she had not been performing care, had not been conscious of choosing her words, had simply said what the moment produced in her. She said, "You'll be all right," not as a promise, not as a certainty, as a statement of something she had seen in people before, in corridors, in the aftermath of the worst things, the specific quality of survival in someone whose interior life has the capacity to convert what happens to them into something that keeps going. She went back to her ward. He stayed in the corridor a while longer and then, in the way that nights in corridors eventually end, went somewhere else, into the rest of his life. John Lennon's grief over Julia's death went underground almost immediately. The culture of 1958 England did not provide a young man with many frameworks for processing the sudden loss of a parent, particularly a parent whose relationship with the young man in question had been as complicated and as full of unlived potential as John's relationship with Julia had been. You did not speak about these things. You did not cry in the places where other people could see. You picked up your guitar and you played louder and you made sharper jokes and you kept moving, because motion was the closest available substitute for the feeling of being all right. But the grief did not disappear. It went into the music. It shaped everything that came after, the emotional register of his voice, the particular quality of longing that runs through even the most apparently light-hearted of his songs, the way certain lyrics would arrive with a directness that bypassed the listener's defenses and found something they had not known was there. The song that came closest to the corridor, to the specific experience of a night in which the most important person in his early life was suddenly gone, was one he would not write for 7 years. In 1965, during the recording of Rubber Soul, John wrote, "In my life, it is, by most critical accounts, the song in which he first fully found the voice that his greatest work would inhabit, meditative, personal, willing to be vulnerable without self-pity, reaching toward the truth of how human experience actually feels rather than how it is supposed to feel." It is a song about memory and loss and the specific weight of places that have been made important by the people who are no longer in them. He did not name Julia in the song. He did not name the hospital or the corridor or the hour he had spent there with a stranger who did not speak for 20 minutes and then stayed anyway. The song did not require those specifics. It worked at a level of emotional truth that was simultaneously his and everyone's, the paradox that the most personally grounded art achieves, becoming more universal the more specifically it comes from somewhere real. But the corridor was in the song. Hour was in the song, the quality of sitting beside someone in the worst thing and not requiring them to be anything other than what they are. That quality was in the song, transformed into music, transmitted to everyone who heard it as something they recognized without being able to name where they recognized it from. Margaret Collins did not know who John Lennon was in 1958. She would not know for several more years. She heard the Beatles on the radio in 1963, heard them with the same half-attention that people who do not listen to music with particular devotion bring to music in public spaces, and noted, in the way one notes things without quite registering them, that the lead singer had a voice that did something unusual, something that reminded her vaguely of something she could not place. She did not place it. She bought Rubber Soul in late 1965, not for herself but for her daughter Catherine, who was 15, and had become the kind of Beatles devotee that 15-year-olds became in 1965. She played it on the family record player one evening while Catherine was at a friend's house, meaning to listen to one or two songs and form an opinion about whether the music was suitable, which was not something she actually had authority to decide, but which parents in 1965 attempted to evaluate nonetheless. She listened to the whole album. She sat in the front room of the Birkenhead house and listened to the whole album without moving. When In My Life came on, the fourth track on side 2, she sat forward in her chair. Something in the song reached toward something in her and found it. She could not have told you exactly what, the melody perhaps, or the quality of the voice, not the famous, charismatic performance voice of the public Beatle, but the voice underneath it, the one that sounded like it was speaking from somewhere real, from inside an experience that had actually happened. She listened to it twice more. And then she sat very still in her front room, in a way she had not sat still in quite that way since she had sat in a corridor in Sefton General Hospital 7 years before, and she thought about a boy whose name she had never learned. She did not put the two things together immediately. It took several more years, took the photographs she saw in newspapers and magazines as the decade progressed, the interviews, the close-up images of a face she had seen only once and only briefly, in the insufficient light of a hospital corridor at night, for the recognition to arrive, and when it arrived quietly without drama, the way true recognitions often do. The boy in the corridor had become the voice on the record. She never told anyone outside her immediate family for a long time. It was not, she felt, a story that belonged to her. She had been a bystander to one of the worst nights of another person's life, had done nothing more remarkable than sit beside him and stay, and the idea of making a story out of that seemed to her both presumptuous and beside the point. The point was the music. The point was what had come out of that night and the years that followed it, what had been converted and transmuted and offered to the world in a form that made it possible for millions of people to receive something real and true about grief and memory and loss and the endurance of love beyond the people who carried it. She listened to John Lennon's music across the years with the particular attention of someone who has a private context for it that nobody else shares. She heard things in it that she could not have articulated, but that she felt the truth of in the specific way that people feel the truth of things they have witnessed at close range. The longing in My Life, the specific quality of absence in the later songs, the way certain vocal moments sounded like someone sitting in a corridor and releasing a name into the air and then sitting with what followed. She was not sentimental about it. She did not believe that her hour in the corridor had been decisive, that without her presence, the music would not have happened. The music would have happened. John Lennon was made of something that was going to produce music regardless, and the loss of Julia was going to be in that music regardless, because it was too fundamental and too formative to stay out. But she thought sometimes that her hour had done something smaller and more specific than making the music possible. She thought it had made that particular night survivable in a way that mattered, had given the boy in the corridor the evidence of one more thing that turned out to be true about the world. That strangers could sit beside your worst moment and not run from it. That presence was possible in the absence of anything useful to say. that someone could stay. These were things John Lennon's music said repeatedly in its own language. These were things the songs gave back to the world. She liked to think there was a connection. She could not prove it. She did not need to. Margaret Collins died in 2003 at the age of 76 in Birkenhead. Her daughter Catherine has spoken in the years since about her mother's private relationship with the music, the way she would sit forward in her chair when In My Life came on the radio, the way she would sometimes become very still during other songs, and then return to the conversation with a quietness that Catherine recognized as the quietness of someone who had just been somewhere privately and come back. Catherine has also spoken about a story her mother told her, once late in her life, the story of a night shift in 1958. A corridor, a boy she did not know whose name she would learn years later from a newspaper photograph. The story of sitting beside someone for an hour and saying almost nothing and then going back to work. The story of hearing a voice on a record player and sitting forward in a chair and thinking about that corridor without quite knowing why. John Lennon never knew Margaret Collins existed. He did not know the name of the nurse who had sat beside him in the corridor at Sefton General on the night Julia died. In the interviews and writings in which he spoke about that night, and he did speak about it, across the years, with increasing directness as he became more willing to be honest about what had formed him, he spoke about the absence of his father and the loss of his mother, and the beginning of a grief that he had converted into music for the rest of his life. He did not speak about the corridor. Perhaps he did not remember it clearly. Perhaps the details of a hospital night at 17 had blurred, as such nights blur, into the general shape of the loss rather than remaining distinct in their specifics. But the music remembered. The music carried what happened in that corridor, carried it in the quality of a voice that knew what it felt like to be sat beside. Worst moment that knew what it meant to have someone stay, that gave that knowledge back to everyone who heard it in the form of songs that did the same thing the nurse had done, arrived without agenda, stayed without requirement, and were simply present to whatever the listener brought to them. That is what the best music does. It sits down beside you. It does not speak for the first 20 minutes. It stays. And if it is very good, if it comes from somewhere real enough, from someone who has sat in enough corridors and absorbed enough of what corridors contain, it says eventually in its own way, in the only language that reaches the place language cannot, you will be all right, not as a promise, not as a certainty. As something witnessed across time from a corridor in Liverpool in the summer of 1958 by a nurse who sat down beside a boy and stayed. What does a stranger's presence in a corridor have to do with the music a generation needed? Perhaps nothing that can be proven, perhaps everything that matters. The corridor was there, the boy was there, the nurse sat down, and 40 years of music followed, music that did, in 3 minutes and 4 minutes and 5 minutes of sound, exactly what that hour of silence had done. It stayed.